Welcome to Scriptura's layer-by-layer overview of Psalm 38. Lord, your arrows have been shot into me, and your hand has struck me. Oh, like a heavy burden, my sins are too heavy for me to handle. Psalm 38 opens with a painful lament, marked by the poet repeating, "There is no sound spot, no healthy spot left in my flesh." David's friends, companions, and his own strength abandon him. His closing words are, "Do not you abandon me too, Lord. Hurry to help me." David was a man who experienced much pain, both from his own choices and from circumstances he could not control. Psalm 38 laments the way he suffers, both because of his own sin, as well as because of the enemies who falsely accuse him and hate him for no reason. David concludes that it is useless for him to even attempt to answer his enemies' accusations. So he becomes like a deaf and mute person who cannot argue at all. He hopes in the Lord alone, who is able to answer. The phrase, "no healthy spot left," captures David's hopeless and fearful feelings in this psalm. David has suffered physically in every way he can imagine. No part of his body has been untouched by the suffering. He cannot hope to be strong enough to change the situation. The Lord alone can help. Psalm 38 has 3 sections, all indicated by vocatives, where the poet directly addresses God. The first we've headed, "My Suffering," for it is a lament on how my sin has caused my suffering. The suffering is so bad that there is no healthy spot left in my flesh. David cannot stop thinking about how he is guilty over his sin, which has gone over his head, and he cannot stop thinking about how he is miserable because of all that he has suffered because of his sin. He describes how he suffers as if he has a disease with wounds that are rotting and burning inflammation all over his body. The situation at this point is that David has sinned, and God has responded by angrily rebuking him. David describes experiencing this as arrows shooting into him and God's own hand striking him. David does not argue that God's judgment is wrong. He does plead, however, that God's judgment is so hard, God has crushed him completely. The poetry emphasizes how much David is suffering, implying that these consequences are too much for David to handle, and God needs to have mercy before David loses all hope. In addition to God's judgment, like arrows, causing David to suffer, David's own companions and friends have left him. Seeing him suffer offended them, so they no longer want to be friends with David. Since he has no friends to help him, David sees his enemies taking advantage of this weakness. They plan to betray him, plotting treachery, and set a trap for him. My strength and my friends have abandoned me, and my enemies pursue my harm. Often in the Psalms, David argues that he is innocent. It is different in this psalm, in which he chooses instead to be like a deaf and mute person who cannot argue about unjust accusations. I am unable to answer. Nothing David can do would help in this situation. He feels abandoned because his friends are gone and his strength is gone, and he feels vulnerable as he can no longer even defend himself. David chooses not to argue, but he does not choose to give up hope. His direct calls to God are grouped in verse 16 as he insists that you, Lord, must answer for me. David depending on the Lord is a theme that is often repeated in the Psalms, but the repetition does not make it less emotionally engaging. After he sees that all the other plans he hoped would save him would fail, all he can do is depend on God. He knows there is more trouble to come. I am distressed about what will happen because of my suffering and my sin and my enemies' baseless accusations. He knows his enemies and his own weakness well enough to expect that difficult times are still coming. His distress continues, even as he confesses his sin and pleads for help. The psalm closes with 4 vocatives, or ways of addressing God. Do not abandon me, Lord. My God, do not be far from me. Hurry to help me, my Lord, my salvation. David's appeal reaches its greatest intensity here, focusing on the only one who is able to save, the Lord, his Lord and God. Psalm 38 is a picture of a man with a long history with God. He knows his own sin, including the suffering that comes directly from sin and the suffering that comes from God's judgment of sin. He also knows enemies show up, even when a person is innocent of sin, and they can cause just as much distress as the consequences of a person's own sin. All these sources of distress come together to overwhelm David. At the same time, all his sources of comfort and help abandon him. His own bodily strength, his friends, and even his ability to defend himself. When faced with suffering on all sides and all help gone, he turns to the Lord as the only one able to answer, able to respond to David's distress. The multiple themes of Psalm 38 can be confusing. Is David complaining simply because he is suffering from his own sin? How do the false accusations of his enemies relate to the reality of his sin? The psalm does not say clearly that it was written about a particular historical incident, but it is helpful to remember some parts of David's life. In 2 Samuel 12, after Nathan confronted David because of his sin with Bathsheba, Nathan prophesied that members of David's family would be murdered, and David would see his own wives taken by another close to him, who would sleep with them in broad daylight. David would suffer tremendously because David had chosen to sin. Then, as recorded in 2 Samuel 15, David's son Absalom spent years stealing the heart of the people away from his father until he had himself crowned king. He slept with the royal concubines and plotted to hunt down and kill his father. In 2 Samuel 16, when David ran away from Jerusalem to save his life, there was a man, Shimei, who publicly cursed him. Shimei cursed David for taking the throne away from Saul, the first king of Israel, and he threw stones at David and those with him. This was a false accusation, however. David always honored Saul, even when it put himself in danger. David's men asked for permission to silence Shimei for treating David in this wrong and shameful way, but David refused to let them. David refused because he suspected Shimei's cursing and throwing stones was actually something God commanded. It was one more form of suffering David deserved after all his sin. David always honored Saul, whom the Lord had anointed, enduring whatever suffering that resulted as Saul hunted him down. In the same way, now, David would honor anyone whom the Lord had sent. David would accept whatever the Lord sent, good or bad, and he would trust the Lord to be the one to speak up and change things. David himself would keep silent. This historical background provides a helpful context for many of the themes. It is not the only way to understand the psalm, but it is one way of understanding how all the themes can fit together coherently with events in David's life.
A Psalm by David, to bring to remembrance. Lord, do not rebuke me when you are angry, or discipline me when you are wrathful. For your arrows have been shot into me, and your hand has struck me. There is no sound spot in my flesh because of your anger. There is no well-being in my bones because of my sin. For my iniquities have gone over my head. Like a heavy burden they are too heavy for me to handle. My wounds have become foul with rot because of my folly. I have become completely contorted. I have walked about constantly mourning. For my sides are full of inflammation, and there is no sound spot in my flesh. I have become weak, and have been crushed completely. I have been groaning because of the severe suffering of my heart.
Before the first section begins, we have the superscription in verse 1. It explicitly says the psalm is by David, which means it should be read as a psalm written by God's anointed, a king over Israel. The king had a covenant relationship with the Lord, which included the obligations of a son to obey his father, as well as the obligations of a father to care for his son. The phrase, to bring to remembrance, is not clear. In some way, this psalm was intended to remind God of the psalmist and his situation, so that God would act and help the psalmist. This first section, my suffering, begins with the vocative, Lord. It is then structured with 4 clauses, providing 3 reasons the Lord should stop disciplining David and take away his suffering. The opening cry is similar to other laments, such as Psalm 6. Do not rebuke me when you're angry. Do not discipline me when you're wrathful. David knows that rebuke and discipline are required sometimes. He himself is a king, and he knows the responsibilities of his covenant relationship with the Lord. Rebuke and discipline can be beneficial within appropriate limits. David here implies that God's rebuke and discipline have gone beyond the appropriate limits. The extent of God's anger and wrath have changed what should be a rebuke that restores into a devastating punishment. And David laments the suffering that seems to never end. The first lament is that the Lord's own arrows have shot him. David recognizes the Lord himself as the source of his suffering. This is the way a lament works in the Psalms. David knows that the one causing the suffering is the one he must ask for relief. God is both judge and healer. The Lord's anger is powerful, with this result. There is no sound spot in my flesh because of your anger. There is no well-being in my bones because of my sin. This summarizes all David's suffering. It has reached every part of his flesh, and even his bones, the body part that provides strength and structure. His very core has been affected. The second lament acknowledges openly his own role in causing the suffering. For my own iniquities have gone over my head. Like a heavy burden, they are too heavy for me to handle. David knows his own choices have led to suffering. His own responsibility informs his lament. But it does not mean he doesn't need to lament, or that it isn't appropriate to lament. The sin is in the past, but the ongoing consequences are miserable. He uses the image of wounds that have become foul with rot, a person completely contorted and walking about as if in mourning. As he ran away from Jerusalem, David and those with him wept, with their heads covered and their feet bare, in a posture of mourning. Every physical sign of brokenness is present: skin disease, an unnatural posture, and public signs of mourning. This language paints an outward picture of David's own inward, broken spirit. The third lament moves inside the body, with pain and inflammation within David's body. The repetition, there is no sound spot in my flesh, reveals David's perspective. God's wrath has hit him from all sides. Nothing is still healthy and whole. The result is David feeling crushed completely, such that he can only groan because of the severe suffering in my heart. The misery is intense, combined with the guilt that his own sin is the reason for his suffering. At least, his own sin is the reason for much of his suffering.
My Lord, everything I long for is before you, and my moaning is not hidden from you. My heart has been pounding, my strength has abandoned me, and the light of my eyes, even that is not with me. Those who love me, my companions, are standing far away from my injury, and my relatives have stood at a distance. And those who seek to take my life have set a trap, and those who pursue my harm have been speaking of disaster, and they are constantly muttering treachery. But I, like a deaf person, cannot hear, and I am like a mute person who cannot open his mouth. And so I have become like a man who does not hear, and who has no arguments in his mouth.
The second section begins with another vocative, my Lord, and the opening, everything I long for is before you, and my moaning is not hidden from you. This is not the first time David has prayed. The Lord surely knows what David wants, and he has heard many prayers. The purpose of the prayer is not to inform the Lord of something new, but for David to respond to his current suffering. Using the language that would be expected if a person had an actual meeting with a king, it is like David has been given a chance to speak to the Lord on his throne about his desires and prayers. It is like they are present at the meeting between the Lord and David. David's own strength and vitality in the image, the light of my eyes, however, have not come. They have abandoned him. Not only his own strength, but those who love him, his companions, have found his injury enough reason to stand at a distance. They do not want to be associated with him. In 2 Samuel 15, we learn that one of his closest counselors, Ahithophel, betrayed David and chose to join Absalom in his plans to betray and replace David. David has been socially shamed, either through a physical disease, which could be a sign of God's displeasure, or through some other shameful event, such as running away from Jerusalem to save his life when his son was trying to kill him. Enemies, those seeking to take my life, are introduced in verse 13. They complete the picture of everything turning against David, his own body, his friends, and now his enemies as well. Ahithophel was useful to Absalom because he could advise him how to best trap and kill David. Many times in David's life, those who were once his friends became enemies, trying to take his life. Verses 14 and 15 stand out as a distinctive passage within the book of Psalms. Although in this psalm, David cries out in lament, in these specific verses, he chooses to be like a deaf and mute person. The deaf person cannot understand and respond without the help of another. The same goes for a mute person. He is unable to speak for himself, so he must depend on another. With this language, David says that he does not intend to respond to his accusers himself. He will let God act. Another example of this attitude was when David ran away from Jerusalem. He replies to the priest who wanted to bring the ark of God, "Take it back into the city. If God is pleased with me, he will bring me back and let me see it and his dwelling again. But if he is not pleased, then I am ready. I accept whatever he chooses to do to me." Similarly, when Shimei curses him and David's men want to silence him, David replies, "If he is cursing me because the Lord told him to do so, there's nothing we can do about it. My son, my own flesh is trying to take my life. How much more then, this Benjaminite who is cursing me? Leave him alone. Let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. Maybe the Lord will see my distress and repay me with good for the cursing I am receiving today." This same attitude lies behind the psalm. David refuses to defend himself, to avoid going against something God himself initiated. But David will cry out to the Lord to answer on his behalf. Although David suffers greatly, it's still possible that the Lord will see his distress and send good his way in the end. That is David's hope.
But, Lord, I have hoped for you. You yourself must answer, my Lord, my God. For I thought that they would rejoice concerning me, those who have considered themselves superior to me when my feet slip. For I am certain to stumble, and my pain is always before me. Although I confess my iniquity, I am anxious because of my sin. And those who are my enemies for no reason are mighty, and those who hate me without cause are numerous, and those who repay evil in response to good accuse me in response to my pursuit of good. Do not abandon me, Lord. My God, do not be far from me. Hurry to help me, my Lord, my salvation.
Verse 16 is the most prominent verse of the psalm, where all David's hope is focused. It opens with three vocatives, not just one, like the previous two sections. It has all three names for God used in this psalm: the Lord, and my God. Recall that the three laments of the first section of this psalm all begin with the Hebrew word ki, for in English. Three more happen in this final section. The seventh ki, appearing between these two sets, occurs here in verse 16. Many poetic features, including the emphatic pronoun I in Hebrew in verses 14 and 18, which are on either side of verse 16, point to the centrality of this verse. It is pivotal for the entire psalm. In the first 2 sections, David has given up all hope. He even gave up hope of defending himself. Nonetheless, there is still one source for hope, the Lord. Even where all else has failed, he concludes, "But, Lord, I've hoped for you. It is you yourself who must answer, my Lord and my God." David gives 3 reasons why it must be the Lord who answers. First, if David tried himself, it would fail, and his enemies would win or triumph over him. These people reliably consider themselves superior any time David suffers a defeat or setback. In the setting with Shimei cursing him, David cannot deny that God is causing another man to seize his throne. David knows that God has allowed Absalom to take over. David is disgraced, running from Jerusalem, and it would do no good for him to defend himself. Second, David knows his problems will continue. He is certain to stumble, and his pain or suffering will always be with him. David knows there is no complete escape from the consequences of his sin. He can only plead for mercy and accept what mercy God gives. He cannot claim a right to be free from the pain his sinful choices have caused. Third, even though David confessed his iniquity, just as he did in front of Nathan, the confession did not make all his pain go away. It would not do any good to keep confessing. So David chooses to not say anything. He chooses to be like a mute person who cannot open his mouth. The result is that David's enemies multiply. He has enemies for no reason, meaning for no legitimate reason. Many people joined Absalom in his conspiracy against him, so David can say that those who hate him or reject him as king have rejected him without cause, and yet are numerous. Even the good David did to Saul was repaid with evil, since Shimei cursed David, accusing him of stealing Saul's throne, when in truth, David always supported Saul. David's enemies are thus his enemies for no good reason, and yet at the same time part of God's reasonable plan to discipline him for his sin. David sees this, and because he accepts God's decisions, he will not defend himself against these enemies, but he will ask God to answer on his behalf. Only God could defend him. This hope in the Lord to rescue David from both his sin and his enemies is woven into the poetry with repeated words and sounds across verses 4 and 5, 16, and 19 to 21. There was no well-being in his bones because of his sin and iniquities in verses 4 and 5. These same words show up in reverse order in verses 19 to 21. He confesses his iniquity and is distressed over his sin, while he laments his mighty enemies and those who repay evil for good. In Hebrew, the words bones and mighty are from the same root, as well as the words well-being and repay. Sandwiched between these repeated sounds and roots is verse 16, that central hope. In spite of all the sin and iniquity, the absence of well-being, and the might of those who repay evil for good, there is still hope that the Lord will answer on his behalf. David still has hope. The Psalms often combine negative and affirmative pleas. David asks God not to do something, and he asks God to do something else instead. It is as if together they make a more insistent plea. Do not abandon me, alongside, hurry to help me. Even if his strength and friends have abandoned him, he is confident that the Lord will not abandon him. He does not cry out with panic, but rather with confidence in the character of the God he knows well. God will not abandon him and will always bring his salvation. David knows God has always proved his character as a saving God. There are multiple forms of intensity in this psalm. The first section depicts intense physical misery, which increases in the second section when David's friends abandon and betray him, and his enemies try to harm him. While the first 2 sections have only one vocative, verse 16 opens the third section with 3 vocatives. David has laid out his lament, which forms an argument in front of God's throne. Although he will not argue in front of people, he will present his argument in front of God. This psalm climaxes in David's resolution to depend on the Lord to answer and act on his behalf, since David will not defend himself in front of other people. David cannot defend himself because he does not know what part of his suffering is from God and what part is not. He is determined to accept whatever comes from God, no matter how difficult. He responds, not by fighting the suffering caused by his enemies, but by pouring out his complaint in front of his God, trusting him to respond. He may have to wait, but he knows his God will not abandon him. He will plead with God to hurry, because he knows his character is always his Lord who brings his salvation. This completes our section-by-section walkthrough of Psalm 38. We'll finish now with the reading of the text that brings everything together.
A Psalm by David, to bring to remembrance. Lord, do not rebuke me when you're angry, or discipline me when you're wrathful. For your arrows have been shot into me, and your hand has struck me. There is no sound spot in my flesh because of your anger. There is no well-being in my bones because of my sin. For my iniquities have gone over my head like a heavy burden. They are too heavy for me to handle. My wounds have become foul with rot because of my folly. I have become completely contorted. I have walked about constantly mourning, for my sides are full of inflammation, and there is no sound spot in my flesh. I have become weak and have been crushed completely. I have been groaning because of the severe suffering of my heart. My Lord, everything I long for is before you, and my moaning is not hidden from you. My heart has been pounding, my strength has abandoned me, and the light of my eyes, even that is not with me. Those who love me, my companions, are standing far away from my injury, and my relatives have stood at a distance. And those who seek to take my life have set a trap, and those who pursue my harm have been speaking of disaster, and they are constantly muttering treachery. But I, like a deaf person, cannot hear, and I am like a mute person who cannot open his mouth. And so I have become like a man who does not hear, and who has no arguments in his mouth. But, Lord, I have hoped for you. You yourself must answer, my Lord, my God. For I thought that they would rejoice concerning me, those who have considered themselves superior to me when my feet slip. For I am certain to stumble, and my pain is always before me. Although I confess my iniquity, I am anxious because of my sin. And those who are my enemies for no reason are mighty, and those who hate me without cause are numerous. And those who repay evil in response to good accuse me in response to my pursuit of good. Do not abandon me, Lord. My God, do not be far from me. Hurry to help me, my Lord, my salvation.